They threw her out at dusk, barefoot, bloodied, with nothing but the torn shift on her back and a clay lantern her dead mother had painted with tiny wolves. Wolfless waste. Alpha Kale had snarled to cheering crowds, his rejection bond searing through her chest like a white-hot blade. Sarah didn't scream. She walked into the Thornwood alone, clutching the lantern against the November cold. She didn't know that 12 broken wolves were already waiting in the dark. She didn't know that by morning, a king would kneel. The rejection burned worse than any wound. Sarah felt it like a fist reaching through her ribs and squeezing. Not her heart, but the invisible thread that had tethered her to Alpha Cal Voss since the bonding ceremony 3 years ago. Now he stood on the great stone dais of the Ashenmoor's pack hall, firelight carving his jaw into something cruel, and he said the words that would end her. I, Kale Voss, Alpha of Ashenmoor, reject you, Sarah, as my mate and Luna. You are nothing. You have always been nothing. The bond snapped. She heard it, an actual sound, like a bowstring breaking inside her skull. The crowd heard it too. 600 wolves packed into the torchlit hall, and every one of them flinched. A rejection bond was not supposed to sound like that. It was supposed to be a whisper, a sigh. This was a scream. Sarah's knees buckled, but she did not fall. She locked her legs, pressed her fingernails into her palms until she felt the warm trickle of blood, and stared straight ahead. Not at Kale. Not at Vanessa. The copper-haired beta female draped across his arm like a living trophy, smirking with teeth that looked too sharp, too satisfied. Sarah stared at the wall behind them, at the mural of the first Ashenmoor Luna, and she thought, I will not give them the memory of me on my knees. Remove her, Kyle said. 2 enforcers seized her arms. Their grips were iron. They smelled of sweat and wood smoke and the faintly metallic tang of barely suppressed wolf. The scent that every shifter carried beneath their skin. Every shifter except Sarah. That was the crime that had defined her life. She had no wolf, no beast sleeping in her marrow, no golden eyes, no shift, no howl. Born to 2 full-blooded wolves, but carrying nothing but human silence inside her. The pack called her hollow, ghost blood, wolfless waste. For 3 years, Kale had tolerated the embarrassment of a wolfless Luna only because the moon goddess's bond was considered sacred, unbreakable, until tonight. They dragged her through the hall, faces blurred past, some pitying, most indifferent, a few openly gleeful. She saw Elder Marin turn away. She saw the kitchen women who had once been kind to her stare at their own feet. She memorized none of it. She was already shutting doors inside herself, sealing rooms, locking away the parts that could still feel. At the pack house threshold, one of the enforcers, Damon, who had once called her Little Luna with something close to affection, hesitated. His grip loosened for half a heartbeat. Keep moving, the other one growled. They pushed her into the night. November cold hit her skin like a slap. She was barefoot. The thin ceremonial shift they'd let her keep was more insult than clothing. White, sheer, the traditional Luna garment now turned into a mark of humiliation. Sarah stood in the frozen mud of the courtyard and felt the doors close behind her. She had nothing. No money, no shoes, no pack, no wolf to warm her blood against the cold. The only thing she carried was a small clay lantern, painted with a ring of tiny wolves chasing each other around its base. The last thing her mother had made before the sickness took her. It hung from a leather cord around Sarah's wrist, cold and smooth and impossibly fragile. Behind her, The hall erupted in celebration. Music, laughter, the sound of Cale announcing Vanessa as his chosen mate. Sarah turned toward the Thornwood, the ancient forest that bordered Ashenmoor territory, the place every wolf pup was warned never to enter alone. The trees stood like black sentinels against the starless sky, and the wind that came through them carried the scent of pine resin, frozen earth, and something older. Something watching. She walked toward the dark. Her feet bled on the frost-hardened ground. The lantern swung gently from her wrist, its painted wolves catching the last of the distant torchlight before the trees swallowed her whole. Inside the pack hall, no one noticed she had chosen the Thornwood. If they had, someone might have stopped her. The forest was not empty, but Sarah was past caring about danger. She had survived something worse than wolves tonight. She had survived being told, in front of everyone she had ever known, that she was nothing. The Thornwood closed around her like a jaw. She walked for an hour before the cold became a living thing. It crept into her bones first, then her joints, then the soft tissue between her ribs where breathing lived. The Thornwood at night was not just dark. It was an absence. No moonlight penetrated the canopy. The only sounds were her own ragged breath and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the deeper black, each snap making her heart seize. Sarah's feet had gone numb. That was almost a mercy. The cuts and bruises from the frozen ground had stopped sending pain signals, replaced by a tingling absence that she knew, distantly, was the beginning of something dangerous. Hypothermia. She'd read about it in the pack's old medical texts, back when she'd been allowed in the library. The body shuts down from the extremities inward. First the feet, then the hands, then the thinking. She was already having trouble with the thinking. The clay lantern bumped against her thigh with each step. A small, rhythmic reminder that she was still moving, still alive, still carrying the last piece of her mother through this merciless dark. The painted wolves on its surface were invisible now, but she could feel their tiny raised forms beneath her fingertips when she touched them. 12 wolves chasing each other in an endless circle. Her mother had painted them the week before she died, humming a lullaby Sarah could no longer remember the words to, but could still feel in her chest, a vibration, a warmth, a frequency that meant safe. Nothing felt safe now. She stumbled. Her knee hit a rock and she felt it distantly, the way you feel thunder through a wall. Get up, she told herself. The voice in her head sounded like her mother's. Get up, little light. There's shelter ahead. You just can't see it yet. There was no shelter ahead. There was nothing ahead but more trees, more cold, more dark. But Sarah got up because the alternative was lying down, and if she lay down, she would not get up again. She knew this with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 years surviving on stubbornness alone. She smelled it before she saw it. A change in the air. The sharp, clean scent of pine gave way to something earthier, damper. Stone and mineral water and the faint musk of animal. A cave. Sarah's hand found the rock face almost by accident, her frozen fingers scraping against limestone. She followed it blindly, feeling the wall curve inward, the wind dying as she moved deeper into what revealed itself as a wide, shallow cave mouth. The floor was dry. That alone nearly made her weep. She crawled inside on hands and knees, too exhausted for dignity, and curled against the far wall where the stone still held some ancient warmth from a day of sun she hadn't been present for. She pressed the lantern against her chest and closed her eyes. That was when she heard the breathing. Not hers, heavier. Multiple sets of lungs working in staggered rhythm, the way a pack sleeps, never all inhaling at the same time, always someone on the edge of waking. Sarah's eyes flew open. In the deeper dark of the cave, shapes moved. Wolves. Not shifted humans, but actual wolves. Or so she thought for the first 3 seconds of blind, electric terror. Then the nearest shape raised its massive head, and 2 amber eyes caught what little light existed, and Sarah saw the intelligence in them. The pain, the hunger, shifters. 12 of them, in wolf form, huddled together in the back of the cave like a tangle of broken furniture. They were enormous, far larger than the Ashenmoor wolves she knew. But there was something desperately wrong with them. Their ribs showed. Their fur was matted with dried blood. One had a leg bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch. Another lay too still, its breathing shallow and wet in a way that meant internal damage. The nearest wolf, black-furred, scarred across the muzzle, easily twice the size of any alpha she'd seen, stared at her with those amber eyes and did something that stopped her heart. It whimpered. Not a growl, not a warning. A sound that said, "Please." Sarah looked at 12 broken wolves in a dark cave and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with the wolf she'd never had. Something older. Something that lived in the marrow of what it meant to be a Luna. Not the title, not the ceremony, but the instinct. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible. "I'm here." She set the clay lantern between them like an offering of light she couldn't yet give. Then she began to work. She should have been afraid. 12 unknown shifters, wounded and feral with pain. Any one of them capable of killing her with a single snap of their jaws. And she was wolfless, defenseless, a small human woman in a torn shift with bleeding feet and no way to fight back. Fear would have been logical. Fear would have been sane. Instead, Sarah felt the strangest calm descend over her, as if some part of her had been waiting her entire life for exactly this moment. As if every humiliation, every whispered insult, every night spent wondering why the moon goddess had made her incomplete had been preparation for a cave full of broken wolves who needed someone with gentle hands and no instinct to dominate. She started with the smallest wolf. A young female, barely more than a pup, silver-furred and trembling against the cave wall. The pup's front paw was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin beneath the fur hot to the touch. Infection. Sarah tore a strip from her shift and wrapped it carefully, her fingers steady despite the cold that was still trying to kill her. The pup whined and tried to pull away. "Shh," Sarah murmured. I know it hurts. But you have to let me." The pup's amber eyes met hers. Something passed between them. Not the electric jolt of a mate bond or the heavy pressure of an alpha command, but something quieter and perhaps more powerful. Trust, offered freely and without condition. The pup stopped struggling. One by one, Sarah moved through the wounded pack. She worked with what she had, strips of her own clothing, cold water from a trickle at the back of the cave, handfuls of moss that she dimly remembered from her mother's old healing books had antiseptic properties. It was crude. It was insufficient. But it was done with such unwavering tenderness that the wolves allowed it, each one watching her with those 2 intelligent eyes as she cleaned their wounds, set what she could set, and murmured a constant, low stream of comfort that was half words and half humming. The lullaby her mother used to sing, the one she couldn't remember the words to, but whose melody lived in her bones. The large black wolf, the one who had whimpered, was the last she reached. He was the most badly injured. 3 deep gashes ran from his shoulder to his flank, the kind of wounds that came from claws, not teeth. Another shifter had done this, an alpha, judging by the depth. The cuts were inflamed, edged with the sickly yellow of infection that had been left too long untreated. Sarah knelt beside him and gently placed her hand on his massive skull. The wolf's entire body went rigid, his eyes, those burning amber eyes, locked onto hers. And Sarah felt something she couldn't name pulse through the point of contact between her palm and his fur. Not heat exactly, not electricity. More like recognition. As if her hand remembered this head and this head remembered her hand, though they had never met. "You're their alpha," she said softly. It wasn't a question. She could feel it. The way the other wolves oriented toward him, even in their pain, the subtle deference in the way the nearest ones kept their heads lower than his. The black wolf made a low sound in his chest. "I'm going to clean these wounds. It's going to hurt, and I'm sorry." She worked on his gashes for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than one. The wolf bore it in near silence, only the occasional tremor in his massive frame betraying the pain. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and realized she was shaking. Not from cold anymore, but from exhaustion so profound it felt like her body was trying to dissolve. She had made a mistake, and she knew it. She had given everything, every strip of cloth that had been protecting her from the cold, every reserve of energy she had left, every ounce of warmth her body could still produce. She had poured herself into 12 strangers and left nothing for her own survival. The cave was freezing. She was nearly naked now, her shift reduced to tatters used as bandages. Her teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue, tasting copper. "It's fine," she whispered to no one. "You're all going to be fine." She curled up on the bare stone floor, pressed the clay lantern against her heart, and felt the cold begin to win. She was going to die here. She had saved 12 wolves and killed herself doing it. The darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. Then something warm pressed against her back. The warmth came from everywhere. The black wolf had moved first, rising on shaking legs that should not have been able to hold him, crossing the cave floor with a determination that bordered on fury, and curling his massive body around Sarah's like a living furnace. His fur was thick despite the mats and blood, and the heat that radiated from his shifter metabolism was volcanic. Sarah gasped as it hit her frozen skin, the sensation so intense it was almost painful. Then the others came. The silver pup tucked herself against Sarah's stomach, her small body trembling but warm. A tawny wolf with a torn ear pressed along her legs. 2 gray wolves, siblings, by the identical markings on their faces, bookended the group, their bodies forming walls against the cave's draft. One by one, all 12 wolves arranged themselves around the woman who had tended their wounds with her bare hands, and asked nothing in return. They buried her in warmth. Sarah wept. She didn't mean to. She had spent 3 years in Ashenmoor learning not to cry. Tears were weakness, and weakness in a wolfless Luna was an invitation for cruelty. But here in the dark, surrounded by the steady heartbeats of 12 wolves who had chosen to save her the way she had saved them, something inside her broke open. Not the way the rejection bond had broken, violent and sharp. This was gentler, like ice cracking on a river in early spring, the water beneath still freezing, but now moving, now flowing, now alive. She cried until exhaustion took her, and she slept deeper than she had in 3 years. When she woke, the cave was different. Pale dawn light filtered through the entrance, turning the stone walls from black to gray to the faintest gold. The air smelled of pine and cold earth and something else. Something rich and complex, that Sarah had never smelled before, but that her body recognized immediately. Pack, not the distant, second-hand version she'd experienced in Ashenmoor, where the pack bond had never fully included her. This was immediate, elemental, a scent that said mine and ours and home in a language older than words. And the wolves were gone. In their place sat 12 people. They had shifted in the night, or perhaps in the early hours of dawn, when the sun's return gave them enough strength. They were still wounded, still battered, but they were human now, and Sarah could see them clearly for the first time. The black wolf was a man. He sat against the cave wall directly across from her, his long legs drawn up, his arms resting on his knees. He was tall, taller than Cale, broader in the shoulders, built with the dense, heavy muscle of a wolf that had been fighting for a long time. His dark hair fell across his forehead, half hiding a face that was sharp-boned and severe, with a jaw that could have been carved from the same limestone as the cave. 3 parallel scars ran down his left cheek, older than the one Sarah had treated. His eyes were the same burning amber she'd seen in the dark, and they were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read. "You saved us," he said. His voice was low, rough, as if he hadn't spoken in days. Perhaps he hadn't. Sarah pulled the remnants of her shift tighter around herself. "You saved me back." "No." He shook his head slowly. "What you did, a wolfless woman, alone, freezing to death, stopping to tend the wounds of 12 strangers, that is not something that gets repaid. That is something that gets remembered." The silver pup was a girl of perhaps 15, curled against the tawny wolf, now a weathered man in his 40s, with kind eyes and a swollen jaw. The Gray siblings were twin brothers, wiry and sharp-featured, watching Sarah with identical expressions of cautious wonder. There were others, a woman with warrior's calluses on her hands, an elderly man with white hair and milky eyes, who Sarah realized with a jolt was blind, a young man barely out of boyhood clutching a wounded arm to his chest. 12 wolves. A pack. A broken, hunted, starving pack. "Who are you?" Sarah asked. The black-haired man held her gaze. In the growing light, she could see that his amber eyes had gold flecks in them, the mark of royal blood. "My name is Ronan Ashcroft," he said. I was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Sarah's heart stopped. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Ronan Ashcroft, the young king who had vanished 6 months ago after a violent coup led by his uncle, Lord Fenris. The entire shifter world had assumed him dead. He was not dead. He was sitting in a cave, wearing wounds she had cleaned with strips of her own clothing, looking at her as if she had hung the dawn in the sky. "These are my people," he continued quietly. "What's left of them. We've been running for months. Fenris's hunters nearly finished us 3 days ago. We crawled in here to die." His amber gold eyes burned. "And then you walked in with a painted lantern and bare feet and told 12 dying wolves it was going to be okay." The silver-haired girl looked up. "She smells like Luna," she whispered. Ronan didn't take his eyes off Sarah. "Yes," he said. "She does." They had 2 hours of peace. Sarah learned their names in fragments. Marin, the warrior woman, who had been Ronan's lieutenant before the coup. Hale, the tawny-haired man, who had been the pack's healer before Fenris's wolves broke both his hands. The blind elder was Orin, once the royal historian, who had lost his sight to a silver-laced blade meant for his throat. The twins, Ash and Elm, were scouts who communicated in half-finished sentences the other always completed, and the silver girl was Lyra, Ronan's niece. Fenris's own daughter, who had chosen her cousin over her father and paid for it with a hunted life. They shared what little they had. Someone had cached dried meat in the cave weeks ago, and they divided it with the careful precision of people accustomed to starvation. Sarah ate slowly, watching the dynamics of the group with the observational instinct that had been her only weapon in Ashenmoor. She saw how they deferred to Ronan, but not with the fearful submission she'd seen in Kyle's pack. This was respect, earned and given freely. She saw how Ronan checked on each of his wolves before eating himself, how his hand lingered on Lyra's head with a gentleness that made Sarah's chest ache. And she noticed how, every few minutes, his gaze returned to her. "Stop looking at me like that," she said finally, not unkindly. Ronan blinked. "Like what?" "Like I'm something you can't figure out." A ghost of a smile touched his scarred mouth. "You are something I can't figure out. You're wolfless." The word hit her the way it always did, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of old shame outward from her center. But Ronan said it differently than Kale ever had, without contempt, with genuine puzzlement. "A wolfless woman," he continued, "who walked into a cave full of wounded alpha-line wolves and made every single one of them submit to her hands. Do you understand how impossible that is? An alpha's wolf does not yield to a stranger. It does not allow a stranger to touch it in vulnerability. And yet you—" He stopped. His nostrils flared. Every wolf in the cave went rigid at the same instant, a ripple of tension that turned 12 wounded people into 12 coiled weapons. The air changed. Even Sarah felt it. A pressure against her eardrums, a heaviness in her diaphragm, the instinctive awareness of something large and terrible approaching. "Fenris," Ronan breathed. He was on his feet in a heartbeat, and the transformation was immediate. The quiet, thoughtful man who had been studying her with golden eyes became something older, harder, something that wore authority the way other people wore skin. An alpha command resonated through his voice when he spoke, and Sarah felt it vibrate in her bones, even though she had no wolf to receive it. "Shift, now. Marin, take Lyra and Orin deep. Ash, Elm, scout the south exit. Hail." "I can fight," the healer said, though his broken hands shook. "You can protect. Take the woman and—" "Sarah." She stood. She didn't know why. She should have been cowering, should have been running. Instead, she stood, and her voice came out steady. "My name is Sarah, and I'm not leaving." Ronan turned to her, and for a heartbeat the alpha command flickered in his eyes, the instinct to override her, to force compliance for her own safety. She watched him fight it down. She watched him choose to see her as something other than a liability. "Sarah." Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had ever sounded before. "You could die. I could have died last night. I didn't. Because of them." She looked at the wolves, his wolves, who had wrapped their broken bodies around her in the dark and given her warmth when she had given them everything she had. "I'm not leaving your pack." Something cracked behind Ronan's amber eyes. Not the breaking kind, the opening kind. Outside, the Thornwood erupted. The sound of 50 wolves in full sprint through the forest, branches snapping, the thud of massive paws on frozen earth, and above it all, a howl that was less music and more weapon. Fenris's hunting howl, designed to paralyze prey with pure, concentrated alpha terror. Sarah's legs went weak. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself small. The howl pressed against her skull like a vice, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Then she felt a hand close around hers. Ronan. His grip was warm, steady, an anchor in the storm of sound. He didn't squeeze. He simply held. "Stay behind me," he said, and shifted. The black wolf that erupted from his human form was magnificent and terrible. A beast the size of a war horse, midnight furred, with eyes like molten gold. His wounds reopened as he shifted, blood darkening his fur, but he didn't falter. He planted himself between Sarah and the cave entrance and loosed a howl of his own. Where Fenris's howl was terror, Ronan's was defiance. It shook the stone. It rattled in Sarah's teeth. And it said, in the primal language of wolves, "You will not touch what is mine." Behind her, 11 wolves shifted. The cave filled with the sound of bones reforming, the wet crack of transformation, the low collective snarl of a pack that had been beaten, hunted, and starved, but not broken. Sarah stood in the center of them, holding a clay lantern painted with 12 tiny wolves, and waited for war. Fenris came through the trees like a landslide. He was enormous. The largest wolf Sarah had ever seen, bigger even than Ronan, with iron-gray fur and eyes the color of a bruise. His wolves flanked him in a V formation, 50 strong, armored in the lean muscle of killers who had been hunting for months and never gone hungry. They moved with mechanical precision, every step synchronized, every snarl perfectly timed. This was not a pack, it was a weapon. Ronan's 12 wolves spread across the cave entrance in a ragged line. They were outnumbered, outweighed, and outmatched in every measurable way. Several could barely stand. The silver pup, Lyra, pressed herself against the wall with her teeth bared and her ears flat, and the sound she made was more sob than growl. Fenris shifted at the tree line. The man who stood there was tall, silver-haired, with Ronan's sharp bone structure twisted into something colder. He surveyed the cave the way a landlord surveys property he intends to demolish. "Nephew?" His voice carried an alpha's resonance, deep and commanding. "You've led me on quite the chase. I almost admired it." Ronan shifted to human as well, standing bloody and bare-chested in the cold dawn. "Walk away, Fenris. This ends here. It ended 6 months ago. You just haven't had the grace to die." Fenris's bruise-colored eyes swept past Ronan and landed on Sarah. He went still. "What is this?" Something changed in his voice. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly masked. "A human?" "No, not human. Wolf-born, but..." His nostrils flared. "Wolfless. You've added a wolfless stray to your band of cripples?" Sarah said nothing. She held the clay lantern against her chest and met Fenris's gaze without blinking. She had spent 3 years under Kale's cruelty. She knew what alpha contempt looked like. She knew how to stand inside it without letting it reach her core. But Fenris was not Kale. Kyle was a small-town bully playing at power. Fenris was the real thing, an alpha who had murdered his own brother, overthrown a kingdom, and hunted children through the wilderness. His aura didn't just intimidate, it suffocated. Sarah's knees buckled. She caught herself on the cave wall, fingers scraping stone, and forced herself upright. "Interesting," Fenris murmured. "She resists." He stepped closer. "Girl, you're standing in the middle of a pack war that has nothing to do with you. Walk away and I'll let you live." "No." The word surprised everyone, including Sarah. Fenris tilted his head. "No? These wolves took me in when I had nothing." Her voice shook, but it held. "They kept me warm when I was dying. I don't care if I'm wolfless. I don't care if I can't shift or fight or howl. I am standing here with them, and you will have to go through me." Silence. Even the wind died. Then Fenris laughed. It was a terrible sound, genuine amusement laced with pure predatory delight. "Go through a wolfless girl? My dear, I won't even have to touch. The lantern lit. Sarah felt it before she saw it, a pulse of heat against her chest, impossible and absolute. The clay lantern that her mother had painted with 12 tiny wolves was glowing. Not firelight, not reflection. The painted wolves on its surface were burning with a soft, golden luminescence that grew brighter with each heartbeat, pulsing in rhythm with Sarah's own racing heart. The light spread. It crawled up her arms like living honey, warm and tingling, sinking into her skin. And Sarah felt something inside her stir for the first time in her 23 years of life. Not a wolf, not exactly. Something deeper, something that had been sleeping in her blood since before she was born, waiting for the precise alchemical combination of selfless love, chosen pack, and absolute defiance that would wake it. Her mother's lullaby surged through her mind, and this time she heard the words. I gave you my wolves, little light. 12 guardians, painted in clay. They'll wait for the night you stop running. They'll know you the moment you stay. The golden light exploded outward. Fenris staggered back, his wolves yelping, shielding their eyes. The light was not violent. It was warm, enveloping, the way sunlight is after a long winter. But it carried a frequency that every wolf present recognized on an instinctual, cellular level. The frequency of a Luna's presence, amplified to a magnitude that none of them had ever encountered. Behind Sarah, 12 wolves lifted their heads and howled, not in pain, not in defiance, in recognition. The golden light poured into them, and Sarah watched, felt their wounds begin to close, bones knitting, fur smoothing, the wet rattle in the injured wolf's breathing clearing like fog before sun. Lyra's swollen paw deflated, and the girl pup yelped not in pain, but in shocked joy. Sarah stood in the mouth of the cave, blazing with light she didn't understand, and realized with a calm that bordered on surreal that she had never been wolfless. She had been something else entirely, something that hadn't existed in 1,000 years. The old texts called it a luminary. Orin, the blind elder, spoke the word first. He couldn't see the golden light pouring from Sarah's skin, but he could feel it. Every wolf within 100 yards could feel it, a radiant warmth that bypassed the physical senses and resonated directly with the bond that connected pack members to their Luna. Except this was not a single pack bond. This was something vast, oceanic, a frequency so deep it touched the bedrock of what it meant to be wolf. A luminary Luna, Orin breathed, his milky eyes streaming tears he couldn't see. The mother wolf's own gift, not a wolf, but the light that calls wolves home. Fenris's attack force had frozen. 50 battle-hardened wolves stood in the dawn light, trembling. Not with cold, not with fear, with the overwhelming, bone-deep compulsion to submit to the presence radiating from the barefoot woman in the cave mouth. Several had already dropped to their bellies involuntarily. Others fought it, their muscles locked, their jaws clenched. But their wolves were screaming inside them, howling in a frequency that said, Luna, 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 with a ferocity that no alpha command could override. Because an alpha commanded through dominance. A Luna called through belonging, and every wolf, no matter how loyal to their alpha, carried in the deepest chamber of their heart the desperate, primal need to belong. Fenris felt it too. Sarah could see it in his face, the war between his human ambition and his wolf's ancient instinct, the crack forming in the mask of cold control. He bared his teeth, and the sound that came from his throat was half snarl, half whimper. Impossible. He he rasped. "There hasn't been a luminary in 1,000 years," Ronan said. He had shifted back to human. He stood beside Sarah, and the look on his face was something beyond wonder. It was the expression of a man who had been drowning for 6 months and had just broken the surface. Since the first Luna walked, since the mother wolf gave her mortal daughter the gift of calling all wolves to peace. He turned to Sarah. The golden light played across his scarred face, softening the hard angles, and his amber gold eyes were wide and unguarded. "You asked why my wolves submitted to your hands," he said. "This is why. They knew. Before your conscious mind knew, before anyone knew, your wolves knew. The 12 on the lantern, the 12 in this cave. They were always meant to find you." Sarah was shaking. The light continued to pour from her, steady as breathing, and with it came a sensation she had never in her life experienced. Completeness. The hollow place inside her, the place where a wolf should have lived, the place that had ached with emptiness for 23 years, was not empty at all. It was full. It had always been full, not with a single wolf, but with the capacity to hold every wolf, to call them, to heal them, to bring them home. Her voice broke. "I don't know how to stop this." Ronan took her hand. His touch was careful, reverent, the way one handles something infinitely precious. "You don't have to stop it. You just have to choose." "Choose what?" "Whether to stay." Behind them, Fenris made his move. Pride won over instinct, as it always did with men like him. He shifted, the massive gray wolf launching forward with a roar that shattered the dawn's fragile quiet, jaws aimed at Sarah's throat. If he killed the luminary, the compulsion would end. His wolves would be his again. He could. Ronan intercepted him in midair. The collision of 2 alpha wolves was seismic. They hit the ground in a tangle of fur and fury, and the sound of their fight was not the stylized combat of ceremony, but the raw, ugly brutality of animals fighting to kill. Blood sprayed across the frost. Teeth found flesh. Claws raked stone. Sarah watched, her heart in her throat, and felt through the newborn bond the exact moment Ronan's strength began to fail. His wounds were healing but not healed. His body was mending but not mended. Fenris was fresh, fed, rested. The math was simple and terrible. She closed her eyes. She poured everything she had, every ounce of the golden light, every frequency of the Luna's call. She focused into a single beam and directed it at the black wolf who had whimpered for her in the dark, who had curled his broken body around hers to keep her warm, who had held her hand and said her name like a prayer. Ronan's next strike shattered Fenris's jaw. The gray wolf crumbled, his form flickered, wolf to man and back, the involuntary shift of a body in shock. And then he was human, broken on the frozen ground, staring up at the sky with bruise-colored eyes that held, at last, something approaching understanding. His wolves began to shift, one by one, not to attack, to kneel. In the golden dawn light, surrounded by wolves both new and old. The 12 who had found her and the 50 who had been called home. Sarah stood barefoot on frozen ground, with a painted lantern against her heart, and felt the bond settle into her bones like roots finding soil. Ronan shifted to human. He was bleeding, heaving, magnificent. He walked to Sarah and did something that no Alpha King in the history of the Northern Territories had ever done. He knelt. Not the performative bow of a political alliance, not the ceremonial bend of a mating ritual. He knelt the way wolves kneel before the moon, fully, without reservation, with his head bowed, his throat exposed. "Sarah," he said, and his voice carried to every wolf present. "I declare you Luna of the Northern Pack, not because you have power, because you have love, and that is the only authority a wolf should ever follow." 62 wolves bowed their heads. The sun broke fully over the Thornwood, and the painted wolves on the clay lantern glowed once more, then went still, their journey complete. 3 months later, the lantern sat on a stone shelf in the great hall of Ashcroft Keep. The keep had been reclaimed in the weeks following Fenris's defeat, not through further violence, but through a steady, quiet revolution of belonging. Wolves who had served Fenris out of fear felt the Luna's call ripple across the northern territories like a change in weather, and they came. In ones and twos at first, then in families, then in entire displaced packs. They traveled to wherever Sarah was and simply stayed. She didn't command them. She didn't even ask them. She existed, and they were drawn to her the way rivers are drawn to the sea. Not because the sea demands it, but because that is where water is meant to go. Sarah stood at the window of the room that had once been the royal study, watching the morning unfold over the keep's courtyards. Below, Lyra was chasing the twin scouts across the training yard, her silver hair flying, her laughter carrying on the cold air. The girl had grown 3 inches in 3 months, as if her body had been waiting for safety before allowing itself to bloom. Hale sat on a bench nearby, flexing his newly healed hands with the slow wonder of someone relearning a lost language. Marin drilled a squad of young wolves in defensive formations, her sharp voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who yells because she cares. Orin sat beneath the great oak in the courtyard center, his blind eyes turned toward the sun, telling stories to a semicircle of pup-aged children who listened with the open-mouthed intensity of youth encountering the marvelous. "He's telling them about you," Ronan said from behind her. Sarah felt his presence before he spoke. A warmth at her back, a steadiness in the bond that hummed constantly between them now, as natural as breathing. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on the top of her head. And she leaned into him with the boneless trust of someone who has finally, irrevocably, found home. "He should tell them about themselves," she said. "They're the ones who survive." "He does. That's the point. The story of you is the story of them." He paused. Kyle sent another envoy. Sarah's stomach tightened. It always did at the name, though the pain had faded from a scream to a whisper over the months. Kyle Voss, who had rejected his fated mate in front of 600 wolves, had discovered, along with the entire shifter world, exactly what he had thrown away. The first luminary in 1,000 years. His mate, his Luna. The political fallout had been spectacular. Ashenmoor was isolated, its alliances crumbling, its wolves requesting transfer to the Northern Pack at an alarming rate. Vanessa, his chosen mate, had left him within a month. It turned out that the copper-haired beta had wanted a powerful Luna's position, not a sinking ship. "What does he want?" Sarah asked. "Forgiveness. An alliance. Your return." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed, not bitterly, not triumphantly. Softly, the laugh of someone who has walked through fire and come out the other side with singed edges and a whole heart. "He can have forgiveness," she said. "Freely. I don't want to carry that weight anymore. But I'm not going back. I'm not his, and I never was. Not really. Not in the way that matters." She turned in Ronan's arms and looked up at him. His scars were silver now, healed but permanent, a map of everything he had survived. His amber gold eyes held hers with a quiet intensity that she had come to understand was not scrutiny, but devotion. the unwavering attention of a wolf who has found the one thing in the world he cannot bear to look away from. "I'm yours," she said simply. "I'm theirs. I'm home." He kissed her forehead, then her lips, and the bond between them sang like a plucked string, a clear, golden note that resonated through the keep, through the pack, through the land. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall. In the great hall, the clay lantern sat on its shelf, its 12 painted wolves frozen in their eternal chase. But if you looked closely, if you looked in that particular slant of late afternoon light that turns ordinary things sacred, you might notice that the wolves were no longer running. They were resting, curled together in a circle, nose to tail, eyes closed. Finally, blessedly still. A quiet, hopeful image. Wolves at rest. A woman who was never broken, only waiting to be found. And a painted lantern that had carried the light of love across the darkest night. Now sitting peaceful and warm in a hall full of wolves who had finally come home. If this story made your heart race, your eyes sting, or your soul whisper, "She deserved better," then you felt exactly what Sarah felt the night she walked into the Thornwood. This is for everyone who was ever told they were nothing. You are someone's Luna. Hit that like button if you believed in her before the light came. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story. Drop a comment below. Which moment gave you chills? Share this with someone who needs to hear that the rejected ones are often the most powerful of all. See you in the next one. The wolves are waiting. The end.